Welcome to chapter 19 and Things Fall Apart. The last big rains of the year were falling. It was the time for treading red earth with which to build walls. It was not done earlier because the rains were too heavy and would have washed away the heap of trodden earth. And it could not be done later because harvesting would soon set in, and after that the dry season. It was going to be Okonkwo's last harvest in Mbanta. So Okonkwo is preparing to leave and go back to Umuofia, and you can imagine he's pretty happy about this as he has been pretty miserable the entire time he's been in Mbanta. The 7 wasted and weary years were at last dragging to a close. Although he had prospered in his motherland, Okonkwo knew that he would have prospered even more in Umuofia, in the land of his fathers where men were bold and warlike. In these 7 years he would have climbed to the utmost heights, and so he regretted every day of his exile. His mother's kinsmen had been very kind to him, and he was grateful, but that did not alter the facts. He had called the first child born to him in exile, Ineka, Mother is Supreme, out of politeness to his mother's kinsmen. But 2 years later, when a son was born, he called him Nwofia, begotten in the wilderness. As soon as he entered his last year in exile, Okonkwo sent money to Obierika to build him 2 huts in his old compound, where he and his family would live until he built more huts and the outside wall of his compound. He could not ask another man to build his own obi for him, nor the walls of his compound. Those things a man built for himself, or inherited from his father. As the last heavy rains of the year began to fall, Obierika sent word that the 2 huts had been built, and Okonkwo began to prepare for his return after the rains. He would have liked to return earlier and build his compound that year before the rain stopped, but in doing so he would have taken something from the full penalty of 7 years, and that could not be. So he waited impatiently for the dry season to come. It came slowly. The rain became lighter and lighter until it fell in slanting showers. Sometimes the sun shone through the rain and a light breeze blew. It was a gay and airy kind of rain. The rainbow began to appear, and sometimes 2 rainbows, like a mother and her daughter, the one young and beautiful, and the other an old and faint shadow. The rainbow was called the Python of the Sky. Okonkwo called his 3 wives and told them to get things together for a great feast. "I must thank my mother's kinsmen before I go," he said. Akwefi still had some cassava left on her farm from the previous year. Neither of the other wives had. It was not that they had been lazy, but that they had many children to feed. It was therefore understood that Akwefi would provide cassava for the feast. Nwoye's mother and Ojiugo would provide the other things, like smoked fish, palm oil, and pepper for the soup. Okonkwo would take care of meat and yams. Akwefi rose early on the following morning and went to her farm with her daughter, Azinma, and Ojiugo's daughter, Obiajeli, to harvest cassava tubers. Each of them carried a long cane basket, a machete for cutting down the soft cassava stem, and a little hoe for digging out the tuber. Fortunately, a light rain had fallen during the night, and the soil would not be very hard. "It will not take us long to harvest as much as we like," said Akwefi. "But the leaves will be wet," said Azinma. Her basket was balanced on her head, and her arms folded across her breasts. She felt cold. "I dislike cold water dropping on my back. We should have waited for the sun to rise and dry the leaves." Obiajeli called her Salt, because she said that she disliked water. "Are you afraid you may dissolve?" The harvesting was easy, as Akwefi had said. Azinma shook every tree violently with a long stick before she bent down to cut the stem and dig out the tuber. Sometimes it was not necessary to dig. They just pulled the stump, and earth rose, roots snapped below, and the tuber was pulled out. When they had harvested a sizable heap, they carried it down in 2 trips to the stream, where every woman had a shallow well for fermenting her cassava. "It should be ready in 4 days, or even 3, said Obiajeli. "They are young tubers." "They are not all that young," said Akwefi. "I planted the farm nearly 2 years ago. It is a poor soil, and that is why the tubers are so small." Okonkwo never did things by halves. When his wife Akwefi protested that 2 goats were sufficient for the feast, he told her that it was not her affair. "I am calling a feast because I have the wherewithal. I cannot live on the bank of a river and wash my hands with spittle. My mother's people have been good to me, and I must show my gratitude." And so 3 goats were slaughtered and a number of fowls. It was like a wedding feast. There was fufu and yam pottage, a goosey soup and bitter leaf soup, and pots of palm wine. All the Amuna were invited to the feast, all the descendants of Okolo, who had lived about 200 years before, and the Amuna is just this wide group of kinsmen. The oldest member of this extensive family was Okonkwo's uncle, Uchendu. The kola nut was given him to break, and he prayed to the ancestors. He asked them for health and children. "We do not ask for wealth, because he that has health and children will also have wealth. We do not pray to have more money, but to have more kinsmen. We are better than animals because we have kinsmen. An animal rubs its itching flank against a tree. A man asks his kinsman to scratch him." He prayed especially for Okonkwo and his family. He then broke the kola nut and threw one of the lobes on the ground for the ancestors. As the broken kola nuts were passed round, Okonkwo's wives and children and those who came to help them with the cooking began to bring out the food. His sons brought out the pots of palm wine. There was so much food and drink that many kinsmen whistled in surprise. When all was laid out, Okonkwo rose to speak. "I beg you to accept this little kola," he said. "It is not to pay you back for all you did for me in these 7 years. A child cannot pay for its mother's milk. I have only called you together because it is good for kinsmen to meet." Yam pottage was served first because it was lighter than fufu, and because yam always came first. Then the fufu was served. Some kinsmen ate it with a goosey soup, and others with bitter leaf soup. The meat was then shared so that every member of the Amuna had a portion. Every man rose in order of years and took a share. Even the few kinsmen who had not been able to come had their shares taken out for them in due term. As the palm wine was drunk, one of the oldest members of the Amuna rose to thank Okonkwo. "If I say that we did not expect such a big feast, I will be suggesting that we did not know how open-handed our son Okonkwo is. We all know him, and we expected a big feast. But it turned out to be even bigger than we expected. Thank you. May all you took out return again tenfold. It is good in these days when the younger generation consider themselves wiser than their sires to see a man doing things in the grand old way. A man who calls his kinsmen to a feast does not do so to save them from starving. They all have food in their own homes. When we gather together in the moonlit village ground, it is not because of the moon. Every man can see it in his own compound. We come together because it is good for kinsmen to do so. You may ask why I am saying all this. I say it because I fear for the younger generation, for you people." He waved his arm where most of the young men sat. "As for me, I have only a short while to live, and so have Uchendu and Unachakwu and Emefo. But I fear for you young people, because you do not understand how strong is the bond of kinship. You do not know what it is to speak with one voice. And what is the result? An abominable religion has settled among you. A man can now leave his father and his brothers. He can curse the gods of his fathers and his ancestors like a hunter's dog that suddenly goes mad and turns on his master. I fear for you. I fear for the clan." He turned again to Okonkwo and said, "Thank you for calling us together." So you have some pretty ominous foreshadowing here at the very end of this chapter, where this older gentleman fears for the clan. And he fears for them because he sees a lot of the young generation abandoning the old ways for this new religion. And he knows that if that continues to happen, things will fall apart. Next time we'll get into chapter 20 and the last part of the novel. Although he had prospered in his motherland, Okonkwo knew that he would have